Most grandparents think their role is to spoil their grandchildren with treats and toys, but Harvard researchers studying multi-generational relationships discovered that what children remember most isn't the candy or gifts, it's the specific words their grandparents never said. I'm going to share something that goes against everything you've been told about being a good grandparent. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the most loving thing you can do might feel uncomfortable at first. After 40 years of clinical practice and working with hundreds of families in crisis, I've identified 7 phrases that create what neuroscientists call secure attachment bridges between generations. But before I reveal these phrases, you need to understand what's happening in your grandchild's developing brain when you speak to them, because the timing and delivery of these words matters more than the words themselves. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and self-understanding, doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. What this means is that when you're talking to your grandchild, whether they're 7 or 17, they're processing your words through a brain that's still building its capacity to understand complex emotions and form lasting memories. The hippocampus, which consolidates short-term memories into long-term storage, is particularly active during emotionally charged moments. This is why your grandchild might forget what you gave them for their birthday 2 years ago, but they'll remember forever the moment you said something that made them feel truly seen. Here's what most grandparents miss. Children aren't looking for more praise. A study published in the Journal of Developmental Psychology in 2019 analyzed over 3,000 parent-child and grandparent-child interactions and found that generic praise like "good job" or "you're so smart" actually decreased a child's resilience over time. The children who showed the highest levels of emotional intelligence and stress tolerance had grandparents who used what researchers called validating specificity, acknowledging the exact struggle the child was experiencing without trying to fix it or diminish it. Your grandchild's nervous system operates in one of 3 states at any given moment. The ventral vagal state is where they feel safe, connected, and open to learning. The sympathetic state is fight or flight, where stress hormones flood their system. The dorsal vagal state is shutdown, where they disconnect and go numb. When you use the right words at the right time, you're literally helping to regulate their nervous system and teaching them how to move from stress states back to safety. This is called co-regulation, and it's one of the most powerful gifts you can give a developing human being. The vagus nerve, which runs from the brainstem down through the body, is the biological mechanism through which this regulation happens. When your grandchild is in distress, their sympathetic nervous system activates, increasing heart rate, constricting blood vessels, and preparing the body for threat response. Your calm presence and specific words can activate their parasympathetic nervous system through what's called neuroception, the subconscious detection of safety or danger. Dr. Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, found that certain vocal tones, facial expressions, and verbal patterns can shift someone from a threat state to a safety state within minutes. Now, I'm going to walk you through the 7 phrases, but I need you to understand something crucial first. These aren't scripts to memorize. They're frameworks for truth-telling that most grandparents avoid because they require vulnerability. The reason these phrases work is because they activate mirror neurons in your grandchild's brain, specialized cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action. When you model emotional honesty, you're literally teaching their brain how to process and express difficult emotions. Mirror neurons were first discovered by Italian neuroscientist Giacomo Rizzolatti in the 1990s when studying macaque monkeys, but subsequent research has shown they're even more sophisticated in humans. These neurons don't just mirror actions, they mirror intentions and emotions. When your grandchild sees you acknowledge a mistake or express vulnerability, their mirror neurons fire as if they're experiencing that vulnerability themselves, creating a neural template for how to handle similar situations. This is how emotional regulation patterns get transmitted across generations, not through lectures, but through lived example. The first phrase grandchildren desperately want to hear is, "I made mistakes with your parents, and I'm still learning." This statement does something remarkable in a child's developing understanding of humans. Relationships. Between ages 6 and 12, children go through what Jean Piaget called the concrete operational stage, where they begin to understand that people are complex and can hold contradictory qualities. When you admit your imperfections, you're giving them permission to be imperfect too. But more importantly, you're demonstrating that growth doesn't stop at any age. A longitudinal study from Stanford University followed families across 3 generations and found that children who heard their grandparents acknowledge past mistakes showed 37% higher emotional emotional resilience scores by young adulthood. These children were better equipped to handle their own failures because they understood that mistakes were part of the human experience, not character flaws. The key is in the second part of that phrase. I'm still learning. This activates what psychologist Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset, the understanding that abilities and wisdom can be developed rather than being fixed traits. But here's where most grandparents go wrong. They apologize to their adult children, the parents, but never to the grandchildren. Your grandchild is watching how you handle being wrong, and they're forming their own internal rulebook about whether it's safe to admit mistakes. When you keep your past mistakes hidden, you're teaching them that errors must be concealed. When you acknowledge them without wallowing or making excuses, you're teaching them that mistakes are information, not identity. The neurochemistry of shame versus guilt helps explain why this distinction matters. Shame activates the amygdala and triggers a cascade of cortisol and inflammatory markers throughout the body. Research by Dr. Brené Brown and others has shown that shame correlates with addiction, depression, violence, aggression, and eating disorders. Guilt, by contrast, is adaptive. It's the feeling that says, I did something bad rather than I am bad. Guilt activates the prefrontal cortex, allowing for reflection and behavior change. When you model taking responsibility without shame, you're teaching your grandchild's brain the difference between these two states. The second phrase cuts even deeper. Your parents are doing things differently than I did, and that's okay. This might be the hardest sentence for many of you to say, because it requires letting go of defensive pride. But here's what happens in your grandchild's mind when they witness tension between you and their parents. The anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain that processes conflict and social pain, lights up like a Christmas tree. Studies using functional MRI imaging have shown that children as young as 4 experience the observation of adult conflict as if they were in physical pain. Your grandchild exists at the intersection of 2 generations, and when those generations are at war, even quietly, the child experiences what's called loyalty conflict. Research from the University of Minnesota found that children caught between disagreeing parents and grandparents showed increased cortisol levels, the stress hormone, for up to 3 days after witnessing or sensing conflict. Elevated cortisol in childhood affects everything from immune function to the ability to form secure attachments in their own adult relationships. Chronic elevation of cortisol during childhood has been linked to reduced hippocampal volume, meaning the memory center of the brain actually shrinks under sustained stress. This affects not just memory formation but emotional regulation, because the hippocampus helps contextualize threats and calm the amygdala. When you reduce loyalty conflict through this simple phrase, you're quite literally protecting your grandchild's brain architecture. When you explicitly state that different approaches are acceptable, you're releasing your grandchild from an impossible position. You're telling them they don't have to choose sides or manage adult emotions. This phrase also models something crucial: respect for boundaries and autonomous decision-making. Your grandchild is learning what healthy relationships look like by watching you, and nothing teaches boundaries better than seeing them in action. I'm going to reveal the third phrase in a moment, and it's the one that grandchildren say they needed most during adolescence. But first, you need to understand the neuroscience of why timing matters. The adolescent brain undergoes massive pruning and reorganization, particularly in the limbic system, which processes emotions. This is why teenagers seem to overreact to everything. Their emotional processing centers are working overtime while the regulatory systems are still under construction. Specifically, the nucleus accumbens, which processes reward and pleasure, becomes hyperactive during adolescence, while the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and decision-making, lags behind. This creates what neuroscientists call an imbalanced brain state, where teenagers are driven by intense emotions and reward-seeking, but lack the neural brakes to modulate those drives. A study in Nature Neuroscience demonstrated that adolescent brains showed heightened activity in the medial prefrontal cortex when processing social evaluation, meaning they're neurologically wired to care intensely about whether they're being taken seriously. The third phrase is, tell me what it's really like to be you right now. Not how's school, not are you staying out of trouble, but a genuine invitation to share their internal experience without fear of advice, correction, or comparison to your own youth. This phrase works because it communicates 3 things simultaneously. First, you believe their experience is unique and worth knowing. Second, you can handle hearing about their real life, including the hard hard parts. Third, you're not going to hijack their story with your own. Here's the practical application. And this is where most grandparents fail even when they use the right words. After you ask this question, you must stay quiet. Research on effective listening shows that the average person waits only 17 seconds before interrupting or redirecting a conversation. Your grandchild needs at least 90 seconds of uninterrupted space to access and articulate their genuine feelings. That 90 seconds will feel eternal to you. You'll want to fill the silence, offer solutions, or share your own experiences. Don't. Your silence is doing the actual work of creating safety. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. When we're thinking about what to say next while someone else is talking, our brain activity shifts from the temporal lobe, which processes incoming auditory information, to Broca's area, which prepares speech production. We literally stop listening at a neural level. But when we commit to 90 seconds of pure listening, we allow the speaker's words to be fully processed by our temporal lobe, then integrated with emotional information from the limbic system, creating what's called deep listening. Your grandchild can sense this difference, even if they can't articulate it. When your grandchild does start talking, practice what therapists call reflective listening. This doesn't mean parroting back their words. It means naming the emotion you're hearing beneath the words. If they say, "School is stupid and all my teachers are unfair," you might respond, "It sounds like you're feeling powerless in a system where you don't have much control." This technique activates the anterior insular cortex, the part of the brain involved in self-awareness and empathy. You're helping them develop emotional literacy by providing vocabulary for their internal states. Dr. Dan Siegel calls this "name it to tame it." When we put words to emotions, it reduces amygdala activation and increases prefrontal cortex engagement. Brain imaging studies show that the simple act of labeling an emotion reduces its intensity by about 50%. You're not just listening to your grandchild, you're teaching their brain how to self-regulate through language. The fourth phrase addresses something that almost every grandchild I've worked with has mentioned: the fear that they're disappointing you by not living up to some imagined standard. The phrase is, "You don't have to earn my love by being successful or well-behaved." This statement directly counteracts what psychologists call conditional positive regard, the toxic belief that love must be earned through performance. Albert Bandura's research on self-efficacy showed that children develop their sense of capability not through constant praise, but through unconditional support during failure. When children believe love is conditional, they develop what's called a fragile high self-esteem, meaning their self-worth is dependent on external validation and collapses when they encounter setbacks. The long-term consequences show up in young adulthood as perfectionism, anxiety, and an inability to take risks or tolerate discomfort. Your grandchild needs to know that your love exists independent of their achievements, their behavior, or their life choices. But here's the sophisticated part that most people miss. You can have unconditional love while still having boundaries and expectations. These aren't contradictory. You're saying, "I love you completely and I expect you to treat people with respect." The and is crucial, not but negates everything that came before it, and holds both truths simultaneously. This distinction is rooted in attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. Secure attachment doesn't mean permissive parenting or grandparenting. It means the child knows the relationship is stable regardless of their behavior, while still learning that actions have consequences. Children with secure attachments actually show better behavioral regulation because they're not operating from a place of fear about losing love. Now, let me share something about your own psychology that might be getting in the way. Many grandparents struggle with this phrase because their own parents made love conditional, and they've internalized that model. You might be thinking, but praising achievement motivates children. It doesn't. Decades of research by Alfie Kohn and others have demonstrated that extrinsic motivation, doing things for praise, grades, or rewards, actually undermines intrinsic motivation, the internal drive to do things because they're meaningful or interesting. The mechanism works through the reward circuitry in the brain. When children receive external rewards for behavior, the nucleus accumbens releases dopamine, creating pleasure. But over time, the brain adjusts its baseline dopamine levels downward to compensate, meaning the child needs more external validation to feel the same pleasure. They become dependent on external approval. By contrast, intrinsic motivation activates different neural pathways involving the prefrontal cortex and creates sustainable engagement that doesn't require constant reinforcement. The fifth phrase is where we get into territory that makes most grandparents uncomfortable because it requires admitting something that feels like failure. "I don't always know what to say, but I'm here to listen." This phrase is powerful because it's honest and because it shifts the dynamic from you as the authority with all the answers to you as a fellow human being navigating complexity. Developmental psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological neurological systems theory helps us understand why this matters. Your grandchild is developing within multiple nested systems: their immediate family, their school, their community, their culture, and their historical moment. Your childhood happened in a completely different ecological system. The challenges your grandchild faces with social media, academic pressure, climate anxiety, and identity formation in an increasingly complex world are genuinely different from what you experienced. Social media alone has changed the neurological landscape of childhood. Research from the University of Pennsylvania found that teenagers who limited social media use to 30 minutes per day showed significant reductions in loneliness and depression after just 3 weeks. The comparison mechanism activated by social media triggers the same brain regions involved in physical pain. Your grandchild is navigating a world where their social status is quantified in real time through likes, comments, and followers, creating a level of social surveillance that no previous generation experienced. When you admit you don't always know what to say, you're modeling intellectual humility, which research shows is one of the strongest predictors of wisdom and effective decision-making. You're also creating space for your grandchild to step into their own authority. Too often, grandparents shut down conversations by offering advice from a completely different context, advice that doesn't fit the current problem. Your grandchild doesn't need you to solve their problems. They need you to be a stable, non-anxious presence while they work through their own solutions. This concept of being a non-anxious presence comes from family systems theory, developed by Murray Bowen. When one person in a relationship system can remain calm and connected despite surrounding anxiety, it changes the entire system. Your grandchild's world is often filled with anxious adults, teachers worried about test scores, parents stressed about college admissions, coaches focused on winning. When you can be present without adding your own anxiety to the mix, you become a regulating force in their life. Let me pause here and ask you to comment below about which of these phrases feels hardest for you to say. Are you in a place where you've already been using some of these with your grandchildren? Or does this feel like a completely new approach? I want to know where you're at geographically too. Drop your location in the comments because I'm curious if these challenges look different in different parts of the country or world. The sixth phrase addresses the elephant in the room that exists in many families but rarely gets named. The way I showed love to your parents wasn't always what they needed, and I see that now. This statement requires you to do something that becomes harder as we age. Acknowledge that our intentions didn't always match our impact. Neurological research on aging shows that older adults often have reduced activity in the anterior cingulate cortex during self-reflection, making it more difficult to question our own past behaviors and decisions. This isn't a deficit. It's actually an adaptive mechanism. The brain becomes more efficient by strengthening frequently used neural pathways and pruning less used ones. If you've spent decades believing you were a good parent, those neural pathways are strong. Questioning that narrative requires creating new pathways, which demands more cognitive energy. But it's possible, and it's worth it. But here's why this phrase matters to your grandchild. Even though it's about your relationship with their parents, they're watching to see if growth is possible, if relationships can be repaired, if it's ever too late to change patterns. Psychologist Mary Main's work on attachment across generations found that what mattered most wasn't whether parents had secure attachments to their own parents, but whether they had developed what she called earned security, the ability to reflect on and make sense of their early experiences. Earned security requires what Main called a coherent narrative, the ability to tell your life story with both positive and negative elements integrated, without idealizing the past or dismissing difficulties. Research shows that parents with earned security raise securely attached children at the same rates as parents who had secure attachments all along. The key is the reflection work, not the original experience. When you do this reflection work in front of your grandchild, you're modeling how earned security happens. When you acknowledge that you didn't always meet your own children's emotional needs, you're giving your grandchild a roadmap for their own life. You're showing them that reflection and repair are always possible, that making amends is a strength, not a weakness. This is especially crucial for grandchildren who are navigating complicated relationships with their own parents. They need to see that families can evolve, that pain can be acknowledged without destroying relationships. The practical application here is tricky. This isn't a phrase to drop casually in front of your grandchild. It often works best when integrated into a conversation where your grandchild is expressing frustration with their parents. Instead of defending your adult child or dismissing the grandchild's feelings, you might say something like, "Parenting is really hard, and I know I didn't always get it right with your mom. I imagine she's doing her best, like I tried to do, but our best isn't always what's needed in the moment." This both validates the grandchild's experience and models compassionate understanding of human limitation. Now, we come to the seventh phrase, and I've saved this one for last because it's the most radical departure from traditional grandparenting advice. Ready? Here it is. Your mental health matters more than your grades, your behavior, or my comfort. This phrase directly confronts the hierarchy of values that most families operate under, often unconsciously. Let me explain why this matters from a neurobiological and psychological perspective. The National Institute of Mental Health reports that 50% of all lifetime mental health conditions begin by age 14 and 75% by age 24. Your grandchild is statistically likely to experience depression, anxiety, or another mental health challenge during the years you're in their life. How you respond to that struggle will either support their recovery or complicate it. Depression isn't just sadness, it's a change in brain chemistry involving reduced serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, neurotransmitters that regulate mood, motivation, and energy. Brain imaging studies show that during depressive episodes, there's reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex and increased activity in the amygdala, creating a state where negative thoughts dominate and rational thinking becomes difficult. Anxiety involves overactivity in the amygdala and the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, keeping the brain in a constant state of threat detection. The phrase works because it explicitly prioritizes mental health over performance and over your own emotional comfort. Many grandchildren report that they hide their mental health struggles from grandparents because they don't want to worry them or because they anticipate dismissal, being told that kids today are too soft, that everyone gets sad sometimes, that they just need to try harder. These responses, while often coming from a place of love, activate shame and disconnection in the grandchild's experience. Dr. Dan Siegel's research on interpersonal neurobiology shows that shame creates a state of neural isolation, where the brain literally perceives itself as alone and under threat. The amygdala activates, flooding the system with stress hormones, while the prefrontal cortex goes offline, making it impossible to think clearly or regulate emotions. When a grandchild shares their mental health struggles and receives dismissal or minimization, their brain learns that vulnerability leads to isolation and they stop reaching out. This is particularly dangerous because social connection is one of the most powerful protective factors against mental health deterioration. Research from the University of Michigan found that a single supportive relationship can buffer against the negative effects of trauma, poverty, and adversity. You could be that relationship for your grandchild, but only if you can tolerate their pain without trying to fix it or minimize it. By contrast, when you communicate that their mental health is the priority, you're creating what therapists call a secure base, a relationship that provides safety and allows them to explore challenges knowing they can return to connection. This doesn't mean you need to become their therapist or solve their problems. It means you're willing to witness their pain without needing to fix it or make it go away to manage your own discomfort. Here's the practical challenge. Most grandparents struggle with this phrase because you grew up in an era where mental health wasn't discussed, where you were expected to just push through, where seeking help was seen as weakness. You might be thinking, but we turned out fine. Did you? Or did you learn to suppress emotions, avoid vulnerability, and never ask for help? Patterns that may have cost you in your relationships and well-being. A study published in the Journal of Gerontology found that older adults who could acknowledge and discuss their own historical emotional struggles had significantly better relationships with their grandchildren and reported higher levels of life satisfaction. The willingness to examine your own relationship with mental health is part of what makes these phrases authentic rather than performative. Your grandchild can sense when you're just saying words versus when you genuinely believe them. Let me tie this all together now, because we've covered a lot of ground, and I want you to leave with clear action steps. These 7 phrases represent a fundamental shift in how you understand your role as a grandparent. You're not the entertainer, the gift giver, or the authority figure dispensing wisdom from on high. You're a co-regulator, a secure attachment figure, and a model of lifelong growth and emotional honesty. The research is clear on this point. A meta-analysis of 47 studies on grandparent-grandchild relationships found that the quality of the relationship, specifically the grandchild's perception that they were unconditionally accepted and emotionally understood, predicted positive outcomes across multiple domains: academic achievement, social competence, and mental health, far more than the frequency of contact or the material resources provided. This finding challenges everything our culture tells us about how to show love. We're conditioned to believe that love is demonstrated through provision, through doing things for people, through solving their problems. But neuroscience shows us that what the developing brain needs most is attunement, the experience of being felt, of having someone accurately perceive and respond to your internal state. When you use these 7 phrases, you're offering attunement, and that's more valuable than any gift you could buy. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, because next week I'm going to address what to do when your adult children don't want you to have a relationship relationship with your grandchildren, or when there's been a family estrangement. That's a painful topic that many of you have asked about, and I promise I'll bring the same level of psychological depth and practical guidance to that conversation. We'll talk about the neuroscience of forgiveness, the process of making genuine amends, and how to hold space for your own grief while respecting boundaries. Until then, be brave enough to try something new, and trust that it's never too late to become the grandparent your grandchildren need. The brain's capacity for neuroplasticity, for creating new neural pathways and changing patterns, continues throughout life. You can teach an old dog new tricks, especially when that old dog is motivated by love and willing to be uncomfortable in service of deeper connection. Start with one phrase this week, just one. See what happens. Pay attention to your grandchild's response, but pay equal attention to your own internal experience. Notice what gets activated in you. That's valuable information that will guide your next steps. And remember, every time you choose vulnerability over defensiveness, authenticity over image management, you're not just changing your relationship with your grandchild, you're changing your brain, creating new patterns that will serve you in all your relationships. That's the beautiful thing about this work. It makes you a better human being, not just a better grandparent. That brings us to the end of this video. For more videos like this, click on the cards on your screen.